Welcome everybody to the third in our new series of CAQDAS webinars, organised by the CAQDAS Networking Project, which is based at the University of Surrey Department of Sociology. I'm Sarah Bullock and I'm joined today by my colleague Christina Silva in hosting this event. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that there are 2 more webinars scheduled before the end of this calendar year, and that, as well as receiving the link to the recording of today's webinar afterwards, you can go to our YouTube playlist and see past recordings and other resources there as well. Finally, some of you may already have seen that we're really pleased to be able to offer discounts on all of our training courses, which we're currently delivering online from now until further notice. We're really aware that training budgets are under pressure at the moment, and so to support researchers and students working from home, we're reducing all of our training fees by 20% for everyone and by 40% for all students, whether part-time or full-time, and wherever you're located in the world. I have great pleasure of welcoming today Dr. Daniel Turner as the founder and director of Quirkos. Daniel gained his PhD from the University of Sheffield in 2008. In his experience of using qualitative research methods since then, Daniel developed the belief that qualitative research is something that everyone should be able to get involved with, and that it should be supported by software that can be learned and taught quickly, driven by the needs of users. In 2014, this belief gave birth to Quirkos. Today, Quirkos is used by organisations around the world, including in the spheres of academia, market research, the public sector, and dozens of charities. Its design continues to be driven by the belief that qualitative software should be simple and should facilitate the greater use and understanding of qualitative research. As well as his work in computer-assisted qualitative analysis, Daniel plays percussion in a local Edinburgh community orchestra. He chairs the board of an award-winning social enterprise that repairs, refurbishes and recycles what others send to landfill, the Edinburgh Remakery. And Daniel also identifies as a bread maker. Just before I hand over to Daniel, a few points for attendees today. So Daniel's keen to make this session interactive. So please do post any questions or comments that you've got in the Q&A chat function. And Daniel will potentially stop at various points during the presentation and ask if there's any questions yet. And if you are happy to vocalise your question yourselves in the live audio to Daniel during this discussion, please precede your question in the chat with the word happy. And if you would rather that we ask Daniel your question on your behalf, just write it out in the chat without preceding it with the word happy, and we're going to ask Daniel your question in the Q&A at the end. Hope that's clear. I'm going to now hand over to Daniel and allow Daniel to take his the space for his slides.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much for the warm welcome. It's great to see you again after so many years. Thanks to everyone for coming today. I really hope this is going to be an interesting session. I'm going to try and touch on some of the things that I think make collaboration powerful, but also challenging. But I'm aware that, as always with qualitative research, there's so many different ways of doing it, so many different types of data, so many different analytical approaches, that it's impossible to kind of do a very kind of broad stroke talking about all of the different issues. That's why I'm very happy for any questions or points of discussion. I don't have all the answers for these, but there would be interesting things definitely to discuss further. And there'll also be links to a couple of resources and blog posts which do talk about some of these things further. So I'm a big fan of collaboration for qualitative data analysis. It's something that I've done in quite a lot of the major projects that I was involved with while I was in university. And as I'll talk about in a minute, something that in recent times in the post-COVID world has really kind of come back. It is now taking up quite a lot of my time again advising other people. So I want to start just by really talking about why collaboration might be a good idea for qualitative analysis. I think there are quite a lot of research projects and quite a lot of researchers who see qualitative analysis as being very much a kind of lone operation, something that you sit at home and do with your own printout and your highlighters, or on your own laptop in a cafe. It's an extremely intense cognitive exercise. And I think a lot of people just want to squirrel themselves away for a couple of weeks or a couple of months and try and get to the core of what's coming out of their data. But of course, there are lots of different projects and lots of different ways of working where collaboration, working with other people in that analysis process, can be a big help. And broadly, I think there's three kind of categories which of kind of advantages to collaborating in the qualitative analysis process. The first of those is a pretty obvious one. It can help to share the workload. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but qualitative analysis is extremely time consuming, and being able to share that data with other people, with other researchers, can help with the time, but it can also help with the quality. That's the second thing. So rather than just relying on one person's interpretation of the data, be that yours or just one researcher's, it's also an opportunity to get feedback on the different ways that things were interpreted, the coding process, and also the kind of wider interpretations of the data. And I think those are all things that, with collaboration, can really lead to an improvement in the quality of the analysis. And then the third thing is the potential for teaching and learning through collaboration. So the potential to break out the kind of black box of coding and show people what happens during the analysis process. And there's no better way to learn than to do, and there's no better way to do than to do it with someone else. And collaboration on a qualitative analysis project is really good as a pedagogical tool, I think, as well. So the first point was sharing the workload. So, as I said, qualitative analysis is an extremely time-consuming process. You may get to the stage where you think transcription is time-consuming, when you're spending hours and hours if you're transcribing yourself, trying to type up every word and every nuance of the transcript, all the pauses and all of the different hand movements and everything else you want to capture. But usually that's nothing compared to the analysis process. Even if you're working with a kind of typical small qualitative data set, so maybe even half a dozen semi-structured interviews or something like that, you'll find that you can spend an almost unlimited amount of time analysing it, each time with a kind of different lens and a different focus. So it becomes an extremely time-consuming process to go through. Many people will take weeks, or as I said before, even months to go through and analyse the data. They'll have very many different approaches to do that. They'll try different types of analysis. They might get stuck and go back and try it all again. And usually it's part of a cyclical process. So you do one tranche of analysis and then you come back and try something else, maybe higher level coding. You may have something like open and axial coding where there are distinct different stages to it. So all of this adds up to a lot of time. And you can share that time by in a couple of different ways. The first of which is basically to share out the sources. So you don't have to analyze all of the different sources in your project. You can choose, you can split them up in half or a third of them if there's 3 of you, and you can divvy them up in that way, which means that there's less for you to go on. You can also divvy up the analysis by the different type of data that you have. So for example, if you have got focus groups and you've got semi-structured interviews, you may feel that it gives a better result if everybody does one particular type of data. So if there's one person that does all the focus groups, there's one person that does all the semi-structured interviews, one person that does all the diary analysis or something like that. So you can also divvy up by type. Now, I think there's a couple of ways in which you could suggest that collaboration can save time. Now, obviously, one of the practical things that comes with a research project is that there's always a deadline, be that a funding deadline, a deadline for the next project, or even if it's part of an assignment. So it's something that we have to do with a very set deadline. And so being able to collaborate and share the work across can help us meet that deadline. But one of the other things is that when we're doing a qualitative analysis approach, which is quite flexible and open-ended, collaborating with other people basically allows you to kind of work in parallel but also kind of learn from each other. So I think it's very powerful that it can kind of prevent the number of times you need to kind of retry, going back through the analysis and trying a different approach. May have the opposite effect. Your collaboration, your other collaborators may suggest different ways of doing it you hadn't thought of before, so it becomes a lot more time consuming to actually go through the process. But in general, I think it can really help kind of focus the process and maybe have just one very deep level of analysis that works all the way through. Now, the second kind of major benefit that I had was about the quality of the data. And one of the kind of the first, there's kind of a series of different aspects to how collaboration can improve the quality of qualitative analysis. And one of the first and the most obvious is to confirm interpretations, to confirm coding, and triangulate that interpretation between different people. So, for example, if you wanted to, you had a particular source and you wanted to see that how you'd understood someone to be talking about something that was negative was being interpreted in the same way, or something that's a bit more subjective. So, for example, you may have a kind of higher level thing. So, if something was too fast, for example, that might be something that you would anticipate different people interpreting someone talking about the speed as being maybe positive or negative. So, being able to confirm and kind of even discuss differences in how people are interpreting the data is a very good way to kind of improve the quality of it. We always get this sense that the process can, I think, be greatly improved by increasing the quality and the number of participants. It's not I think it's something that has a kind of natural cutoff. I don't think that with most qualitative analysis, adding people necessarily increases the quality. We hear a lot in qualitative analysis about issues with rigor and bias because it can be so subjective to interpret qualitative data. I'm not someone who particularly has a very kind of positivistic view of qualitative analysis that says that necessarily rigor is something that is a good thing to aim for in all types of qualitative research, but certainly it's something that for a lot of larger projects is a really important thing to do, and having multiple people interpret and come to the same conclusions can help improve the trust in the process and also the outcomes and the conclusions that we draw from the data. It can also kind of minimize the bias potential from just one individual, but again, I don't think collaboration is necessarily again a panacea for that. Just because you have two people, that doesn't mean that you both have the same biases. You're probably both university educated from a similar background, and so being conscious of your existing kind of reflexivity is an important part of minimizing the bias, not just having more than one person contribute. But it's also about more than the kind of normal contributors that we could have. So I'm really interested always in participatory analysis, so having participants involved in the analysis process as well. When we're dealing from the very rich lived experience of our participants, it seems fair not only to ask for their opinions, but to also give them some sense of ownership of the data and the interpretation of the data. So just because I've interpreted somebody say as being something that was negative, they might not see it in the same light. That may be because of our own interpretations and our own biases. So co-production and having participants involved in the analysis of qualitative research is something that I think also can greatly improve the quality where it's appropriate to do that. But it also allows for cross-disciplinary work. And I don't mean just kind of across different parts of the humanities, but there may be also getting involved people from different schools of management or even philosophy to look very much deeper into a particular project and particular research finding and how it's better kind of situated in society. So going outside of your kind of normal box of your normal co-collaborators can be very powerful to improve the quality of interpretations again. So it's a big thing that for me, again, the potential to widen the pool of participation. So how many people can be involved in interpreting the results. The third and final kind of major benefit, I think, is the ability to use it as a pedagogical tool. So I think for a lot of students, especially when they're coming to qualitative analysis for the first time, they can kind of understand doing semi-structured interviews, they understand the qualitative data collection, it's all quite exciting. But when you get to the analysis, it's something which the textbooks can only really kind of tell you so much. It's something I think you've really got to get your hands dirty with some data and dig in and kind of see what's coming out there. It always seems like such a black box of analysis. How did someone interpret this in a particular way? How do they know what codes to create? And I think being able to collaborate on a project, so being able to, even if it's working on an example data set, or being involved in a real research project, being able to look at that data and see as it goes along how it's being interpreted and codes are being created and so forth is a really powerful way to learn. So it's one of those, it's kind of like old adages. I mean, I think that you learn better by doing, and observing is a very important part of that, but to actually, again, as I said, get involved in the analysis and learn can be a very powerful thing. So with that said, I've just got kind of one more point before I'll stop for my first point of questions. So those are kind of my kind of background reasons why I think collaboration and working together on qualitative analysis can be very useful. And now we get to the particular circumstances in which we find ourselves today. And that is that we suddenly have to work remotely. Suddenly it's very hard to collaborate in person. There are a lot of restrictions on meeting up. A lot of universities don't have their offices open. There are restrictions on the number of people that you can meet up with, even in a cafe environment. So it's become, in the last kind of 6 months or so, I've spent a large chunk of my time trying to help people with changes to the way that they work. Even kind of before any of this stuff happened, I would describe collaboration as a very difficult dance. So when you're working on a project yourself, you basically only have yourself to manage. You can do what you like, you understand what's going on. But as soon as you start collaborating, you need to have a plan which other people can understand. You need to be able to actually communicate what your aims are, what you're trying to do. And all of those things are very difficult kind of people management tasks to do. And so it becomes kind of a dance where, like all good dancing, you can have someone that leads, but if they dominate too much, I don't think you get the best quality, you don't get the best experience out of that. And then we've got this other situation going on as well. So with the COVID landscape at the moment, the restrictions on how we can collaborate, how we can work, and even the kinds of data that we can collect at the moment, I'm supporting a lot of teams across the world who are trying to work together in new ways. And a lot of people who, when they started their research projects, thought that collaboration was going to be a lot easier. They may have thought that they was going to do, workshops just working with nice pieces of flip chart paper and post-it notes and things like that. It's a way that I love working, and I do a lot with qualitative projects, but it's become very difficult to do right now. Certainly the situation in the UK, as far as I'm aware, most of the universities, although open, the offices are not open. There are very few spaces where you can get together. And in a lot of countries, actually, the restrictions are even stronger than that. And so that means that people are trying to work from home and trying to find other ways to collaborate. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping to talk about today. So Sarah, I'm just going to pause right there and just ask if people have got any other questions about those kind of benefits, or any other benefits that they see, or anything else that was unclear from what I said so far before I get into the detail of some of the ways that we can kind of practically manage collaboration.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. It's Christina here, actually.
Hi.
So, hi. Thanks very much for that. That's really interesting. I've got lots of questions myself, but we do have a question that's come through in the live event Q&A, which I'll read out for you to answer. But just to say, anybody else, if you have questions, then please do feel free to post those as well. So this is one of the questions that we had. Is that, Daniel, you mentioned that you're not necessarily holding a positive position that sees rigour as important. what might be an alternative to rigour in qualitative data analysis. So in other words, what would make a qualitative study which is not seen as rigorous in that positivist way valuable nevertheless?
So, okay, so okay, this is something that I could talk about for the rest of the presentation, but I'll try and it's my own kind of interpretation, my own kind of perspective. I think that a lot of qualitative projects have great value because they are exploratory, because they're kind of pushing the boundaries of what questions we can ask and how we can ask them. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there are easy answers and easy interpretations. When we're doing the classic kind of open-ended kind of grounded theory kind of investigation of something, where we're really letting the data kind of set the themes and the questions that are coming out of the data, I think it's okay to embrace the kind of individual interpretation. It's a good starting point. I often see qualitative research as a kind of a partner to more kind of rigorous methods that might be larger, rigorous qualitative projects, but it may also be quantitative projects. And what I kind of mean by that is qualitative research, sometimes we can get different answers out of. So we can get actually different questions out of it. It can actually ask questions which we can then go through and approach in a more rigorous fashion. But I think it's okay to have exploratory research where someone else would have come up with a different interpretation or would have set a different question from that research. As long as we're clear about the limitations of the data and our interpretation, and we're looking at our own reflexivity, I still think that that has a great deal of value. Some projects, yes, it's great to have an aim of rigor, but to be exploratory, I think, is something that I value quite a lot in quite a lot of qualitative projects. I hope that kind of explains where I'm coming from in a kind of brief way.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. We do have another question, but it's specifically about software. So I think maybe we'll wait until I think you're going to talk about software in a bit more detail later on. So if you don't mind, can I ask one of the questions that I had?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Which was one of the first things that you said, Daniel, was talking about how many researchers discuss quite a lot about how time-consuming transcription is. But you made the comment that actually analysis is often a lot more time-consuming than transcription. So I wondered whether you think it's common that researchers don't plan enough time for their analysis, and if you have any tips about mitigating that at all.
Yeah, in fact, this is kind of like one of the themes of like a blog post that I wrote a couple of weeks ago, which you probably read. I think, yeah, a lot of the time, so that blog post was trying to encourage people to do a research plan for their qualitative software, for their qualitative project. And a lot of the time, I think people get very excited about the methods, choosing the methods and collecting the data. That's the exciting, the hands-on bit of it. And they don't leave enough time for what comes at the end. And there's two reasons for that. First of all, I think people underestimate the amount of time analysis takes. And second of all, is that it's something which, okay, in something like grounded theory happens as you're collecting the data, but often happens at the end of the data collection. So if the data collection gets delayed or there's some issue with the ethics board before you can start collecting the data, everything starts getting pushed towards the deadline. And it's the analysis and sometimes even the writing up that gets kind of squished at the end. The trouble with analysis is where it can be quite easy to anticipate how long data collection might take, how it takes to take an interview, how long it's going to take to approach enough people, etc., etc. It's very difficult to estimate how much time to leave for analysis because it's not a linear process, because it's often cyclical and it just goes over and over itself, building on itself with each layer, but there's not usually a very clear endpoint. And it's often the case that you get stuck, as I said, and just have to go back and try in a different way, looking at it in a different light. And so people don't tend to factor in enough time to try something different, to have something not work. And that may even be trying software. and then go back and trying something else. So I think, Christina, it's something that you would appreciate from the 5-level QDA approach. It's always best to know what kind of analysis you want to do ahead of time, even before you start collecting the data, even before you start deciding on the methods necessarily, because that will help you anticipate how much time to leave for analysis, because it can take an extremely long time.
Yeah, great. I agree with
I don't know what your own
that.
interpretations would be. Is there a guideline of how much time to leave for qualitative analysis?
More time than you think you need is what I would
That's it.
normally say. But you know, like many things in qualitative data analysis, there isn't a sort of one size fits all answer to these questions, is there? Thanks, Daniel. That's really interesting. There's one more question that I'd quite like to pose to you now before I let you move on, if that's okay. So another question that's come through is, how do you balance confidentiality in collaboration?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question, and something that I have got a bit of a slide coming up on. But basically, there's a couple of things to work out. The first of which is, how much confidentiality do you need? So if you've been clear with your ethics board that you're going to have multiple collaborators on the project, who they are and where they are, and if that's clear to your participants when you've got consent to use their data, then that can be okay. Obviously, the other thing is to make sure before you start collaborating that your data is ready for collaboration, and that may mean anonymizing the data, so taking out names and places. Now, again, depending on the type of data, that might not be enough. Somebody might be talking about something so specific that even changing the names and changing the artificial names of the workplaces, it's really clear what someone's talking about. So it's definitely something to be wary of. The other thing is, there may be other ways in which collaborators can engage without having to see all the data. It may be that some of the sources of data or some of the types of sources of data don't have the same kind of confidentiality issues, and it may be that actually just sharing certain extracts with a collaborator rather than the whole source of extracts of data which are interesting but don't have any particular participant identification data in them can be another way to kind of get a sense check on how you're doing your coding without having someone to go through all of the different sources of data. So there are a couple of ways you can help mitigate that. It's a really good question. I'm going to touch on that a little bit more in a minute.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I'll let you continue with your presentation, but great discussion. Thanks for the questions, everybody. Do
keep them coming. That's really great.
Coming. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Great. So before we start talking about the software, I'm just going to talk about 3 of the kind of major practical considerations on working at the analysis stage of the project. Now, there's going to be some more things coming out in a bit later, but these are some of the things which I find kind of trip people up if they're not kind of anticipating it. And the first of which is managing the data. So we've got this data. How do we share it with people? How do they get to collaborate on it? How can they contribute to that? So the first issue, this follows on a little bit from what we were talking about, the confidentiality issues, is what to share. So do we need to share all our sources of data with all of our potential collaborators? If we're tranching up the data, they only need to see maybe a certain amount of it. So maybe that makes the process easier. If we want everybody to, if we're kind of like cross coding and trying to see if we're agreeing on the coding on the same sources, maybe we want to share all of the different sources of data. And when we're doing that sharing, what is it we're sharing? Is it just a transcript? Is it a video and audio? Is it a picture? Is it something more tangible? And how can we literally share that with a large number of people? And there may also be issues of who gets to see what. There may be some collaborators that want to see not just the data, but kind of more participant information, so demographic data and things like that, where it may not be appropriate to share that. So whatever way we share the data, we need to make sure, again, as I said before, that it may be anonymized already. That might be appropriate to do at this stage. Or it may be that there are certain aspects of the kind of metadata, so stuff about the participants that we don't want to share, and it may be entire sources or entire types of data that we don't need to share and collaborate. So being specific about what we need to collaborate with and why can really help when we come to manage the data. Now, the big issue which usually comes up with collaboration is what happens with any corrections to the data or edits to the data, especially when working with transcripts. There are always typos and there are always mishearings and there are always spelling mistakes and things, or things that didn't get anonymized that you want to fix as you go through. And it's becomes quite difficult to do this when you're collaborating with data, because as soon as one person's edited a document, it's not the same as everyone else's. And so that can start to mean that if you're doing kind of line by line coding, you may be looking at different lines. Somebody may have different paragraphs. Somebody may have different words which they've realized from listening to the recording, again, were misheard, that completely changes the data. And it becomes very difficult to bring that data back together again with people's interpretations and coding on if it's been edited and if it's different. So my plea is always to try and kind of sanitize the data as much as possible before you share. So try and check that there aren't any kind of like major glaring things that you need to change. And if there are, you need to have a process for feeding that back and collaborating and keeping that all in one place. So everybody's working from the same data file. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how software can help do that in the future. But in general, what I'm trying to say is, although we're talking about software, these things apply even if you didn't do it on paper. I've worked on collaborative projects where everything was on printed out A3 pages. It was literally handed from person to person, and that is a way to share, and that is a way to manage the data. So these are pretty generic things that I'm trying to focus on here. And depending on what collaboration approach you take, there are going to be different pitfalls and different advantages to doing it in different ways and different things to think about. So that's managing the data. The second thing is managing the code. So assuming you're doing some kind of coding or some kind of thematic analysis, and you may not be, how do you manage the codes between the different collaborators? If you're doing some things like framework analysis, this tends to be quite simple. If you've got a set of codes or themes that you're going to use to interpret the data, these have been discussed and agreed with ahead of time, even in a collaborative process. So lots of people are contributing to what things we should be looking for, or it's the result of beta testing with a small amount of data with a couple of sources. Then it's very easy to share those codes and get everyone to code to the same codes in the same way. If you're doing something like grounded theory or inductive coding, where you're creating themes and codes on the fly, or codes to start with and then themes, so open and axial coding and all these different approaches, or IPA, where you're doing line by line kind of interpretations, then you have a very different issue. Now they've got an example down there on the screen where we've got this code for negative, but what happens if this wasn't set as part of the framework analysis, or maybe it was, but one of the collaborators created extra codes for bad and disadvantage? Are these the same things? Are these the same interpretations? Do they mean the same thing? They probably have slightly subtly different interpretations. Bad's not the same as negative. A disadvantage is kind of negative, but it's not the same. And what we do with those codes, whether we merge them together, whether we have we keep them separate, and then we may get an issue where we end up with hundreds or thousands of codes because everybody's interpreted it using slightly different codes called slightly different things. That's something we need to anticipate and manage ahead of time. We can look at some of the ways to work with that. But not just the codes themselves, we also need to think about managing the coding process. So we need to have probably a set of guidelines to describe how codes are going to be used. So are people allowed to create their own new codes? Should they stick to the ones they have? Can they change the name of codes as the data changes and things begin to shift around and the meaning of things changes? So it's good to have a kind of set of coding guidelines that will not only describe what the rules are around using and creating codes, but what codes mean. So a lot more detail about what a particular code like negative is, and guidance for when it should be applied. Again, we're going to look in the software at some of the ways that you can facilitate this, but it's very important to make sure that everybody understands what a particular code means, and ideally it's often recommended to have examples of where you'd apply that code or a different one. For an example where you had things like negative and bad and disadvantages, you want to be very clear what the differences are between them. And this process is something that will be dynamic, especially if you're doing something like grounded theory. And so you need to have processes where you will be communicating with each other, coming back, checking with each other how you're using codes, and updating each other, updating those guidelines about how these codes are fitting the data and how things are changing as we go along. So it may very well be that software can help with some of these managing problems. A lot of people talk about what qualitative software does. I think it's a misnomer to call it analysis software. It's usually really used as a management tool. It's a data management tool to help you kind of keep things in the right place, keep things organized, and keep together all the different things you need to use your brain to interpret the data. When you start collaborating with people, it basically seems to kind of square the problems of having codes and different interpretations and sharing the data. But software can help facilitate that process. And it doesn't have to be qualitative analysis software. Again, I've done projects that worked with just Excel projects, and the qualitative analysis was done just in Excel. Now, spreadsheet and Word document files, we can collaborate with those. We can use something like Office 365 or Google Docs, and we can have a single document that lots of people can work on at the same time, and they can collaborate on, and they can edit, and they can challenge. So we don't always need to use specialist software. Even if you're not using one of those kind of cloud versions of those software, if you've written a paper before with multiple authors, you'll be used to just sending documents backwards and forwards between each other, merging things together, looking at the changes, looking at all the different iterations and comments and things, and then accepting all the edits and all those kind of things. So those same ways of managing other types of data can work for qualitative data as well, but there are disadvantages to that as well. It doesn't usually have a lot of the structure set up for you, so you need to be very disciplined using them in that way. And most people, I think, especially for larger projects, will hit a brick wall pretty quickly. And although it may seem like it's quick to start using a tool you're familiar with, like Word or Excel, it usually ends up by the time you're writing up that it's become so difficult to find what you want in the data and to extract it from that in a useful format that you begin to lose a lot of time at the end of the process. Now, there's also tradition. So I'm now going to talk about the CAQDAS software in two different kind of tranches. So the first is traditional CAQDAS software. So that's things like MaxQDA, Atlas TLI, Offline, and NVivo, and Quirkos as well. So these are different software packages that basically save the data in a project file, just like working on a Word file or a single spreadsheet file. But there are also qualitative software that works in the cloud. So Quirkos does this as well. There's now Atlas TI Cloud, and there's also specific tools like Deduce, which were designed from the outset to do this. Now, the advantages they have, we'll talk about in a minute, but it means that it's much easier to share the projects because that can be done from within the software, and it also allows collaboration. So you can work on the same project at the same time or sequentially without having to worry about how you send a file backwards and forwards. But whichever approach you come up with and whatever software tool you use, you need to make sure that it's going to work for all the different team members. Do all the team members have access to the data, to the software? If they're working from home, if they're working from laptops, what operating system are they using? Are they Windows or Mac or Linux or something else? Do they only have Chromebooks? Do they have good connection to the internet? Do they have access to a particular license for a particular software package? So if some of your collaborators are used to using NVivo and some others are used MaxQDA, then Will they be able to talk to each other? Okay, there's the REFI-QDA exchange standard, which allows you to import and export projects backwards and forwards between different compatible software. But that's not quite the same as using the same data in the same tool. And if somebody's not familiar with another platform, but you're expecting them to suddenly use NVivo when they've never used it before, there are different access issues going on there as well. There's also the very practical issues about project storage and access. What I mean by that is, where are you going to keep your project data? So maybe that's the project file itself from the software. And how will people be able to access that? Do they need logins? Do they need passwords? Do they need to go through a VPN? Is it on a university network? Do all your collaborators have access to that? Is it going to be on a USB drive that gets passed around? That's really difficult to do right now. Is it just going to be emailed across people? Well, that can work. So these are all things about the file-based access that we need to consider. So we can have a central storage point for our qualitative project, all the data that's going in it. And that could be in a network location like Dropbox or OneDrive or something like that, that everybody can access. We need to make sure everybody has access to that. We can also do this with email. We can just email a file backwards and forwards, as long as it's being worked on sequentially, and merge the files together if people are working at different points. It usually helps to have a kind of master file or a template file that's the basic starting point, so that everybody's starting from the same set of data and with the same coding framework or the same guidelines, if that's appropriate for the analysis approach that you're taking. But we also need to think about, if we have those individual files, how they're going to be shared. Again, it's very difficult to share USB drives at the moment, but also if there needs to be a checkout system. So if we're working with files, many of them can't be edited by more than one person at a time. That will cause issues. And it may be we need to decide how a particular person and when a particular person can access a file. That's always one of the issues with file-based access. When working in this way, I generally recommend people create duplicates of the project file, whatever the qualitative software package they're using, but then constantly try and merge back. There needs to be someone who's kind of leading the project and taking the lead on merging the projects back together, making sure that everything's still working and people are working in the right way. Now, the other option, opposed to the file-based access, is the cloud-based access. So this means that the data is stored in a live database. So it's not just having a file somewhere, but something that everybody can log in and be working on at the same time if they want to work like that. But it also allows not just for these kind of individual projects where everyone works at the same time, but also people can have their own project and then merge them together later. That's still possible with the cloud version. The main advantage is that with this way of working, you can have live collaboration. So everybody can work together at the same time from across the world, and they can see the changes which are happening to the project in real time. And they can even kind of chat and have a discussion about that. And I'll show that very briefly later. And that's a major advantage for it. But it also allows for sequential access. So just because the project's stored in the cloud doesn't mean you all have to work at the same time. It means everybody can work whenever they want at their same pace. The difficulty with an individual file basis is that if somebody doesn't feel like working today, they're hungover, or it's a weekend and suddenly they've got some free time, if they've not checked out that file for that time, they can't work on it. But it's possible to work sequentially or concurrently with any of these cloud services. You can also manage the different permissions that the different users have. So different collaborators may be able to see different sources, different parts of the data, or some people may just be able to look and not edit. And those are important things that we can facilitate with a kind of cloud permissions basis. However, it's not a universal panacea. It doesn't make everything a lot easier. It has its own caveats. Still needs to have a management process for how you're going to work together, a kind of people management process. And you still need the same guidelines for what you're going to do with the data and how. And it has different access considerations. So again, everybody might have access to the internet or a particular software tool, or be working on a particular operating system. And there are also different cost implications. All these cloud All these cloud softwares are usually based around a subscription-based license, monthly or annually, and that's something that certain project budgets may not accommodate for. You need to consider what happens after the project's done and what happens to that data. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basic guidelines which can help with teamwork. I'm just a little bit conscious of the time, so I'm going to try and get through some of these now. The guidelines for your team need to say what you're going to code and how you're going to code it. That's a very basic thing, but it's something that people may have a very different interpretation of what that means for them. So you need to be clear about what their expectations are. You need to be clear about which project and where the project file is, and who's going to be working on which sources if you're divvying them up in that way. So that needs to be clear as well. You also need to be clear about your timescales. Are you expecting all your participants to, all your collaborators to be finished within 2 weeks? Is there a set deadline? Do people need to work during particular hours of the day if you want to work together? If you're working across different time zones, how does that work if you want to work at the same time? All these things should be in your guidelines. You should also have regular meetings during the process and have a space for updating the guidelines, being able to flag issues and change the direction of things if things are not going in quite the right way. Now, when we come down to the practical considerations for collaboration, at the moment that increasingly means remote working, and so that comes with its own kind of practical considerations as well. We need to have clear communication channels when we're collaborating with qualitative analysis that go beyond just working on the project. So we may need to have, as we said, regular meetings, or email is probably the best way to go backwards and forwards still, but maybe it's a chat room. Maybe it's in a Discord server, maybe it's just having a kind of like a Zoom meeting every now and then. But these channels need to be clear and they need to be accessible for all the different participants. But it's also important during the collaboration process to record that process, to have some way of describing what's happening and why certain decisions were made, what things were challenged, as well as just getting to the outcome, so that the fully analysed data at the end. For me, I feel that the value is in the difference in the data. For collaboration, I think there's a lot of emphasis on making sure everybody's coding the same way. But for me, I think the most important things are the times when people disagree, when people are not coding things the same way, when people have got different interpretations of the data. And it's important to highlight those and use those to spark debate and discussion. While there is value in having that confirmation, everybody coding the same way, it's likely that those things that people are not agreeing on are the more difficult issues and probably the more interesting issues. So don't just flag those as things to kind of brush over and make disappear. They're very important parts of the discussion and the analysis process. Now, it's also possible to collaborate after the analysis process. So now, when you've done all your analysis, you can show it to someone else, even if they weren't involved in the analysis process, and say, does it make any sense? So sense checking often happens working with community groups to say, you know, our interpretations of the data, does this sound right to you? So it's a good opportunity for community engagement, and that is a type of collaboration, depending how far you want them to go in looking at the analysis process. Peer review is also a kind of collaboration, and it may increasingly be the case that peer reviewers want to see the analysis process, and so in some ways they are kind of looking in at that data. And the other thing to think about is the potential for secondary data archives. So I'm a big fan of considering the kind of open data world. I mean, some funders are demanding that data gets anonymized and put in central databases now, so in archives so that other people can use them. And that's an important thing to think about. It's actually kind of a collaboration. And most of these things which apply, setting guidelines, describing your processes and procedures, are very important to consider your data for secondary analysis use, as well as during the actual process itself. Now, someone asked a very good question at the start. There are ethical considerations to put in mind as well. So, are the participants aware of the number of people that will see the data and who those people are? Are they at different universities? Are they outside the university? May they be someone who's kind of compromised and has someone like a boss or someone like that who can see what they're saying in a negative light? Are the ethics review board, the institution review board, are they happy with the process that you have for sharing the data? Does it meet your data confidentiality and data protection guidelines, especially where that data is being stored. Some IRBs state that the data must be kept on a particular laptop or in a particular system. And if you're collaborating with people in different institutions, that becomes very difficult to facilitate. Now, Quirkos has been around, as Sarah said in the introduction, since about 2014 now. In the last year or so, we've added a cloud-based feature to Quirkos, mostly because of the demand for collaboration and working in this kind of way. It's become extremely popular. It's really exploded over the last 6 months or so. What we offer in the Quirkos Cloud is exactly the same interface and the same way of working and analyzing qualitative data, but with unlimited sharing of the data, so you can have as many projects as you like and as many collaborators you like on those projects. It has exactly the same identical interface and features as the offline version, and you can switch between them as you want. And those features are identical on Windows, Mac and Linux. So it does make, if people are working on different platforms, it's not a problem in Quirkos at all. We now have a growing world network of secure data servers. So if your data protection requirements mean that data has to be kept in a particular country under particular guidelines, we're increasingly able to meet that now. We also have the cheapest subscription for any of the cloud services which are out there, and a 14-day trial so that you can see it for yourself. But there are other products available, and most of them have the same basic functionality and a whole series of other features which make them unique and probably more suitable for you than one of the other tools. So do check them out. Again, they've all got pretty much all of them have got free trials, and there are open source options in there as well. So Taget even works in a browser, it's open source, so a very fun kind of place to start working, and you can collaborate in that as well. So very, very quickly now, I'm going to show you just for about a minute or so how the collaboration looks in Quirkos and some of the tools for that, and then I'm going to open up for the final questions and discussions. I'm trying to leave as much time as possible for that. So there are two kind of aspects to the collaboration. So the first is in your account page on Quirkos, so on the Quirkos website when you log in, you can see all the projects that you have there. This is my testing account, so it's got lots of strange projects in here. All the projects have a little share button here. You just click on the share button, and then you can click share with. I'm going to share with myself, a different email address. So you just need the email address of someone else who's got a Quirkos account. And you can choose here whether you give them read or write access. So I'm going to give the person write access. That means that they can edit the file as well. And so I just click the share button, and that's all done there. So what that means now is that I'm able to work on that project as well. So now if I open up Quirkos, and if I go to my list of projects here, when you start the Quirkos here, okay, it's timed out. Because this was sitting running for the last hour. You've got these lists at the top and the bottom, which show you let's start this again. The projects which have been shared with you at the bottom and your own projects at the top. And so you can work on those projects at any time. There's this little chat function in the bottom right of the screen, and this lets you work on the data and see what's going on. You've also got the option here to chat with people, and when you're working with the data in Quirkos, you're collaborating in real time, so you're able to see the data and see other people's changes as they happen in real time. There are also all these tools here in the query view, so that you can see the different software and the different things which people have done, and you can do a side-by-side comparison. So if you wanted to see how one collaborator had coded a particular document compared to another collaborator, then you can see that in a side-by-side view. I was going to show a little bit more about that, but there's lots more information about that on our website, and lots more video tutorials too, which are specifically about the collaboration features. So now I just want to, open up for any questions that people had. And thanks for listening.
Fabulous, Daniel. Thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed listening to your talk, and it was really great to hear your practical tips for collaboration, as well as your initial discussions about the principles to think about. and also, of course, the role of software. So thanks so much for that. There are a couple of questions that we've got for you. First of all is a question from Anne Lewins, I think, which refers to actually the lovely analogy that you used about collaboration being like a dance, which I love the odd analogy, especially around qualitative analysis. But Anne was wondering whether using software, qualitative software, makes the difficult dance more difficult or less difficult. You've obviously spoken about that a little bit, but I was wondering whether there are any particular challenges around that you just wanted to re-emphasize.
I think it makes the dance easier in general, but with any approach you take, it's really the planning that makes those things easier and understanding the process. If you understand the software, what it can and can't do, then I think it does make that dance a lot easier. And it makes dancing with lots of different people easier, because you can kind of see what different people have done, how people are working, because you can facilitate that live working together, especially at the moment when you can't be face to face. I think it does make the collaboration easier, but it depends on the project and how you want to work and how your collaborators want to work. And I think whether you want to use software or not, as long as you've thought through the process of how you're going to do that, how you're going to do the collaboration and sharing, I think either way can work, but planning is really the key.
Yeah, great, thanks. A couple of questions about other resources, two questions which I'll ask together if that's okay. First of all, is there a source which compares the features of different software packages, including Quirkos? And secondly, are there any publications about collaborative analysis that you would recommend?
Okay, so the first question, I would suggest the CAQDAS network is a good place to start. So they've got reviews of all the different software packages, including some of the new cloud ones. So that's a really good place to start. The other thing is actually the Wikipedia page for qualitative analysis software has a good kind of feature tick box, although it doesn't talk very much about the kind of cloud and collaboration features. It's a little bit out of date from that kind of point of view. So the second question, are there any other resources and articles? Yes, there's quite a few. I had a slide which has got 2 of the blog posts articles. If I can put that back up quickly, is that all right?
Yeah, go for
it. Share my screen again. Okay, so we've got 2. So the first blog post here is written by Helen Cara. So it's a fantastic, sorry, the second one is written by Helen Cara, and it's a fantastic look at some of the reasons and ethical considerations of why qualitative analysis may be better from an ethical and quality point of view. And the top one is a kind of overview. Both of those have got links to other resources in them. Off the top of my head, I don't have links to share, but those are a good place to start. And if you just go to the quirkos.com/blog, you will quickly be able to find the links to those particular articles if you aren't able to kind of copy these down. But I guess we'll probably share these as well.
Yeah, we're going to be sharing the recording of this with everybody tomorrow probably. But that's great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to pass over back to Sarah, who's going to round up for us. I'm conscious of the time, but just to say to everybody else, if you have further questions for Daniel, then you can continue posting them while we just finish up, and we will ask Daniel those questions, and hopefully you're happy, Daniel, to answer those via email, and we can forward those on with the recording tomorrow. But I think Sarah also had a question about time saving, so she'll ask that and then round up. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thanks a lot. Yeah, a quick question about saving time. So we all challenge our own coding over time if we're working on our own, and sometimes we challenge it kind of all the way until the end of a project. Having others there to kind of ask you questions about your coding kind of earlier on, maybe than they had occurred to you, could in a way then also be seen as saving time, right? Because you've got extra minds kind of challenging and asking questions. So I was just wondering whether you've worked with teams before who've kind of maybe used team working as a way of fast tracking discussions around coding, rather than as ways of getting the maximum amount of coding done?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Often, yeah, as you say, you go through and you change the codes you need and what you mean by different codes. Yeah, and I think especially if you've got people who, if they're working in parallel and you're looking at different sources of data, so you've kind of split up the data set, you can very quickly have a conversation with people and saying, well, I think that this is emerging as a clear theme, and someone else will say, no, but the sources I'm working with, I think this is a more clearer theme. So it can be a quicker way to get a bigger kind of in-depth sense of the data and what's coming out there. I've not specifically worked on projects where that's been an aim, the kind of accelerating the time has been an aim of that kind of collaboration, but I think it does help that kind of getting all the way to the end and then suddenly discovering, oh, okay, the last two sources completely changed everything. I think it just reduces the risk that can happen, but it still could happen, and it could be the case that it actually makes it worse. You've just got so many different interpretations and you're changing your mind so many times that you need to go back and then work again, and you may not have anticipated that if you were working just on your own. Again, I would argue that, okay, that's probably going to improve the quality of the analysis overall, but again, it's one of those things in planning for the analysis you just need to kind of factor in as a possibility. Okay,
thank you so much. Thanks for taking that last question. That's all that we've got time for at the moment. Thank you so much again to Daniel Tanner for joining us here at the CAQDAS Networking Project's webinar series today. Also,
thanks for inviting me.
It was a pleasure to have along. Thank you. And thanks also to all the attendees who made it along today. You're going to get the recording from the CAQDAS Networking Project by email. But also we will post it up on YouTube probably tomorrow, as Christina said. Do join us for the next couple of webinars that we've got scheduled, and looking forward to also hearing what you thought about today's session on Twitter and starting up the conversation there. So thanks everyone. Lots of good wishes from us here, and everybody keep well. All the best. Bye-bye now.
Bye.